This movie is about macros again, and it's running macros this time, the different ways that you can run a macro. Beginning with assigning a shortcut key to it, make it so it activates when you click on a graphic object, assigning it to a command button that we add to the ribbon, assigning it to a command button we add to the quick access toolbar, and we can even kick off the macro and make it run as a result of an event like opening the workbook. So we're going to go through different ways to kick off a macro and to run a macro, but first we have to actually create a macro. So the scenario is that we have some data here, and we have several columns worth of data, but let's say it could be 50 columns worth of data that you get in, only you're not interested in all of the columns. You're interested in displaying only some of the columns, and you don't want to go through every time you get this data and hide the columns that you're disinterested in. So what can we do? We can first select the columns that we want to hide, and in this case, for this scenario, I'm going to hide those 4 columns. I'm going to left-click the drop-down for the Format command in the Cells group, and then left-click Hide Columns. From here, we can set up a custom view by going to the View tab, left-clicking Custom Views in the Workbook Views group, and adding a new view which I'm going to name Chapter 50. Left-clicking OK. So first I'm going to unhide those columns, going back to the Home tab, the Format drop-down in the Cells group, unhide columns, and now we're ready to record our macro. To do that, I'm going to click on the View tab and go to the Macros drop-down in the Macros group, left-click Record Macro, and I'm going to name this macro Hide, and I want to save it in this workbook because it really wouldn't make sense in another workbook considering what we're actually doing here. Left-click OK, and I'm going to activate our custom view and stop recording the macro. And I actually want a second macro. So I'm going to left-click the macro drop-down, record another macro, and call this one Unhide. Again, I want it to be stored in this workbook. Left-clicking OK. I'm going to go to the Home tab, select the entire worksheet, go in the Cells group, left-click Format, and go to Unhide the columns. I'm done recording that one. And now we have 2 macros, one that will hide the columns that we don't want to see and one that will unhide the columns that we don't want to see. So how do we activate these macros? Other than going to the View tab and View Macros and selecting one and then running it, which is what we did in the last movie. Well, one of the ways we can do it is we can assign a shortcut key by left-clicking Options to a macro that already exists, and this is the Hide macro. You can assign a shortcut key, and the thing to be careful about when you're doing this is that if you assign a shortcut key that is also one that's already utilized with some other functionality of Excel, like Control-S or Control-P, and there are many more, you'll overwrite that functionality, and instead of saving your workbook, in the case of Control-S, you'll actually kick off this macro. And I'm going to assign this one Control-Shift-H. So to do that, hold the Shift key down and press H. Sort of makes sense. And the other one, Options, Shift-U. So now I have both of my macros assigned to some shortcut keys. I'm going to close that. And when I press Control-Shift-H, my custom view is activated. When I press Control-Shift-U, my columns are displayed. Now, when I recorded the macro, I didn't deselect the worksheet. I still had it selected, and that's why at the end of that macro, we still have the workbook selected. So there's another way we can run these macros, and that is to insert a shape or any kind of graphic object. I'm going to select this shape, and I'm going to format it as a button by choosing that. When you right-click it, you have the option to assign a macro to it. I'm going to assign the Hide macro, left-click OK, and I also have the ability to edit the text. And without regard to formatting it, I'm going to just put hide there. And now when I left click that button, that activates the macro and we get the custom view displayed. And if you want to select this shape without activating the macro, press and hold the control key and then select the shape. And I did that because I want to copy it. So I'm going to press Control C, go to a location, paste. And since it's an exact copy, it'll kick off the same macro that the original will kick off. So what I want to do with this one, right-clicking it, is I want to assign the unhide macro to it. I'm clicking OK. And then I want to edit the text to say unhide. I'm going to click off of that. So I can go back and forth between the two views quickly. And of course with shapes, I'm going to hold the control key down, select them both. I can align them so they look a little bit better. Another option that we have is to add a command button to the ribbon. I'm going to right click a blank space on the ribbon, left click Customize Ribbon, left click the drop down under Choose Commands From, and then left click Macros. And there's our two macros. I'm going to left click and choose the first one. So first I need to add a group. I'm going to add a new group and call it My Macros. Left clicking OK, and I'm going to add my two macros to that group, hide and unhide. Select them, and I can choose one of these symbols to be associated with that macro. And I don't know, let's pick the down arrow for hide and the up arrow for unhide. Left clicking OK. We now have our macros. We can unhide and hide. We can unhide and hide. So we can do the same thing to the quick access toolbar. Customize the quick access toolbar. It's the same process. We select the macros. We add them to our QAT. Left clicking OK. Unhide and hide. Yet another way that we can activate these macros is to have them activate upon an event. And to do this, we need to go back to the VBA editor, which we can reach by pressing the Alt F11 keys. The first thing you need to do is select this workbook within the workbook that you want to add this event-driven macro to. We're working out of Chapter 50. We want to define this event for the Chapter 50 workbook. So double-click this workbook, and then left-click this drop-down, select Workbook, and you'll get a list of options to select from as far as what event that you want to attach this macro to. I'm going to select the Open event, which is the default. Then I need to find the macro that we recorded, that we wanted this event to actually activate, and that's going to be found in the modules. It's in Module 3. You may have a different set of modules. I've been playing around with this before I recorded this movie. But if you've been following along, you'll have two macros, one called hide and one called unhide. Now what I want to do is copy the code by selecting it, pressing Control C, and going back to the event trigger that we just created. I'm going to tab over once to make it a little bit easier to read, and then press Control V to copy that code into this event-driven macro. I can now close the VBA editor, and I'm going to left-click Unhide the columns, save the workbook, and I'm going to close the workbook, and then I'm going to open it back up by going to the recent area backstage by pressing Alt-FR, selecting Chapter 50, and now those columns are collapsed. So every time I open up this workbook, that macro upon the event of opening the workbook is automatically activated, and our custom view takes over and displays for us the result of what we've saved in our custom view. So that's running a macro. We first created two macros so we would have some macros to run, and then we assigned a shortcut key to each one of those macros, and then we assigned those macros to a graphic object which in this case were shapes that we formatted to look like buttons. We then added command buttons on the ribbon to activate our macros, and then we added command buttons on the QAT to do the same thing. And lastly, we went to the VBA editor to assign a macro to an event.